The Prussian Empire didn't stand on the sword, but on the deceitful silence of a wife. Behind her, King Frederick William IV was a soulless shell. Ravaged by strokes, speechless and insane, he existed as a living corpse for 4 years. The glittering palace became a secret hospital, hiding the gruesome decay of absolute power. This tragedy was not born of a man destined to be a vegetable, but of a visionary whose fall was absolute. When he ascended the throne in 1840, he was a man vibrating with intellectual energy, while his father had been a rigid, austere soldier who viewed the state as a machine. Frederick William IV was a dreamer. He was a man who wept openly at the sound of beautiful music, who corresponded with the great thinkers of his age, and who sketched architectural plans with a skill that rivaled professional draftsmen. He was the driving force behind the completion of the colossal Cologne Cathedral, seeing those twin spires not just as stone and mortar, but as a spiritual lightning rod that would unite the German soul under God. He possessed a mind that was constantly racing, filled with a nostalgic, almost feverish love for the Middle Ages. He did not want to be a modern bureaucrat. He wanted to be a medieval patriarch, a loving father figure to his people, ruling by divine grace in a world ordered by Christian chivalry. He was charming, witty, and arguably the most intelligent man to ever sit on the Hohenzollern throne. But his intelligence was of the volatile, neurotic kind. He was high-strung, prone to sudden shifts in mood, and possessed of a nervous system that seemed to lack the protective coating required for the brutal realities of 19th century politics. He was an artist who had been cursed with a crown. The tragedy of Frederick William IV is that he lived in a time that had no patience for romantics. The mid-19th century was an era of steel, steam, and rising democracy, forces that cared nothing for his medieval fantasies. The friction between the king's imaginary world and the hard pavement of reality began to grind him down long before his arteries failed him. The first great crack in his psyche, the event that we might call the psychological stroke before the biological one, occurred in 1848. This was the year of revolutions, a contagious fire of democratic fervor that swept across Europe, toppling governments from Paris to Vienna. When it arrived in Berlin, it shattered the king's world. For a man who believed he was the father of his people, the sight of his children building barricades and demanding a constitution was not just a political crisis, it was a personal betrayal. In March 1848, the streets of Berlin turned into a slaughterhouse. The king's army fired on the crowds and hundreds of civilians were killed. In the aftermath, the mob, fueled by grief and rage, carried the bloodied corpses of the fallen revolutionaries into the courtyard of the Berlin Palace. They piled the bodies beneath the king's balcony and howled for him to come out. What followed was a moment of humiliation that would fester in Frederick William's brain for the rest of his life. Terrified, pale, and trembling, the king stepped onto the balcony. The crowd demanded he show respect. Slowly, painfully, the King of Prussia took off his cap and bowed to the corpses of the commoners who had defied him. The Queen, Elizabeth Ludovica, who stood by his side, was reported to have muttered, "All that is missing now is the guillotine." For Frederick William, this was a psychosexual emasculation of the highest order. He had been stripped of his divine aura. He later described those days as a time of terror that made him physically ill. He felt dirty, violated by the stench of the revolution. Though he eventually regained control, crushing the revolution with military force and reneging on his promises, the damage to his nervous system was permanent. The charming, optimistic prince was gone. In his place sat a bitter, paranoid, and deeply reactionary monarch. He began to see enemies everywhere. He retreated further into his religious mysticism, convincing himself that he was the victim of a demonic conspiracy. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He would oscillate between manic periods of activity, talking incessantly, issuing contradictory orders, planning grand projects, and deep comatose depressions where he would stare at the wall for hours. His physical health began to mirror his mental state. The king, always fond of a good table, began to gain weight rapidly. He suffered from what his physicians called abdominal congestion, a vague 19th century term that covered everything from digestive rot to heart trouble. His face, once open and handsome, became bloated and flushed, the skin taking on a dark, unhealthy, ruddy hue that betrayed high blood pressure. He was plagued by insomnia and shortness of breath. The doctors prescribed trips to spas, mineral waters, and bloodletting, but they were treating the symptoms of a machine that was being driven into the ground. By the mid-1850s, the court at Berlin was walking on eggshells. Everyone knew the king was unwell, but the nature of his illness was a state secret. To admit that the monarch was mentally instability was to invite the liberals back into the streets. So, a curtain of silence was drawn. The king's outbursts were explained away as royal eccentricity. His sudden memory lapses were attributed to overwork, but those closest to him saw the terrifying signs of degeneration. He would sometimes lose the thread of a conversation mid-sentence, his eyes glazing over only to snap back moments later with a flash of anger. He began to have trouble with his handwriting, his once elegant script becoming jagged and cramped. The tension was unbearable. It was the feeling of watching a dam that has developed a hairline fracture. You don't know when the water will burst through, but you know the structure cannot hold. The king himself seemed to sense his own mortality. He spoke often of death, of joining his ancestors, yet he clung to power with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He refused to delegate. He insisted on reading every dispatch, signing every law, as if proving to himself that he was still the master of Prussia. It was in the summer of 1857 that the biological clock finally struck midnight. The king was traveling, and during a visit to Marienbad, he suffered a minor incident. It was not catastrophic, not yet. It was a stumble, a moment of confusion, a slur in his speech that lasted only an hour. His physicians, terrified, diagnosed it as laryngeal catarrh, or a minor infection, lying to themselves and to the public. But they knew it was a warning shot from the cerebral arteries. The blood flow to the seat of his intellect was being interrupted. The king was returned to Sanssouci, the place he loved most, in the hopes that the quiet air of Potsdam would heal him. But nature is not sentimental, and biology does not respect the divine right of kings. The recovery was an illusion. Throughout September of 1857, the king was living on borrowed time. He was irritable, suffering from headaches that blinded him, and a constant ringing in his ears. The atmosphere in the palace was suffocating. The queen hovered over him, her face a mask of anxiety. The king's brother, Wilhelm, the soldier, the pragmatist, the man who would one day become the first Kaiser of a united Germany, watched from the sidelines with a mixture of fraternal concern and cold political calculation. He saw a ship without a captain, drifting toward the rocks. Then came October. The air in Potsdam was turning crisp, the leaves in the great park of Sanssouci turning to gold and blood red. The king had finished his dinner. He was in his private apartments, perhaps preparing to work on some architectural sketches or read a theological tract. Suddenly the world tilted. A massive vessel in the king's brain burst or was blocked. He collapsed. There was no grace in it, no poetic final words, just the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor, the scramble of servants, the screams of the queen. When they lifted him onto the bed, he was unconscious. The silence that fell over Sans Souci was heavy with dread. For days, he hovered between worlds. The court held its breath. Would he die? In many ways, death would have been the merciful release. It would have preserved his dignity. It would have allowed him to be remembered as the tragic victim of the revolution, the artist king who burned out too soon. But Frederick William IV did not die. He awoke. And this is where the true horror begins. The man who opened his eyes in that lavish royal bedchamber was no longer the king of Prussia. He was a biological shell. The stroke had ravaged the left hemisphere of his brain, the area responsible for language and logic. The king, who had prided himself on his eloquence, who had used words as his primary weapon and tool, opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out but a guttural, meaningless sound. He had been struck with severe aphasia. The I, the ego, the consciousness, was likely still trapped somewhere inside that skull, looking out through eyes that could see the weeping face of his wife, the stern faces of his doctors, the familiar damask of the walls. He knew who he was. He knew what he wanted to say, but the wires had been cut. He was a prisoner in his own flesh. He tried to gesture, but his right arm, his writing arm, his sketching arm was dead weight, paralyzed by the same stroke that had stolen his voice. The doctors descended like vultures. In the 1850s, neurology was in its infancy. Their treatments were medieval torture dressed up as science. They applied leeches to his neck to draw down the congestion. They blistered his skin with caustic substances, hoping the pain would shock the nervous system back into action. They administered enemas and emetics, stripping the king of his last shreds of physical privacy. He endured it all with the confused, frightened whimpering of a child. This was the beginning of the living death. For the next 4 years, the Prussian state would be engaged in a grotesque conspiracy to pretend that this broken man was still reigning. They could not let go. The queen could not let go. And so the stage was set for a tragedy that would play out in the slow, agonizing motion of a nightmare. The king was about to descend into a hell of nappies, restraint straps, and silence, all while the world outside continued to bow to his name. Yet the horror was not just in the decay itself, but in the awareness of it. The tragedy of the aphasia was that it was likely not total. There is evidence to suggest that the king retained some receptive language capabilities. He could understand, at least partially, what was being said around him. He could hear the doctors discussing his hopeless case in hushed tones. He could hear his brother Wilhelm talking about the regency, effectively planning the takeover of the government. He could hear the queen weeping at night. He was a silent witness to his own obsolescence. He was a man buried alive in a coffin of his own flesh, listening to the mourners shovel dirt onto the lid, unable to knock, unable to scream, unable to tell them that he was still in some small, terrified corner of his mind, still there. This biological destruction was the crucible in which the final phase of his reign was forged. It stripped away the romance, the art, and the philosophy, leaving only the brutal, mechanical reality of existence. The King of Prussia was no longer a ruler. He was a specimen. He was a case study in the fragility of power. All the armies in Prussia, all the gold in the treasury, and all the prayers of the church could not unclot a single artery or regenerate a single neuron. The romantic on the throne had become the patient in the chair, and the long, slow sunset of the Hohenzollern monarchy had begun in the darkened, urine-scented bedroom of Sans Souci. The degradation was absolute. It was not a swift execution which carries a certain martial dignity. It was a slow rotting. It was the kind of suffering that feels pointless, devoid of lesson or redemption. It was simply the biological machine breaking down, gear by gear, while the human soul trapped inside watched in mute horror. And as the year 1858 dawned, it became clear that this was not the end. The king would not be granted the mercy of a quick death. He was condemned to endure this twilight existence for years. The man was gone, but the husk remained, and the husk still wore the crown. The tragedy of Frederick William IV was not merely that he lost his mind. It was that his body refused to follow suit. In the grand abstract theater of monarchy, the king is an idea. He is the state. He is law. He is history. But in the hushed, overheated bedroom at Sanssouci, the king was a biological organism in catastrophic failure. As 1858 dragged on, the separation between the king eternal and the king mortal became a chasm that no amount of gold braid or velvet could bridge. Yet, for 4 years, the daily existence of the most powerful man in Prussia was defined not by policy or diplomacy, but by the rhythm of his own biological incontinence. The degradation was absolute. In an era without sterile medical supplies, the sovereign was forced to lie in his own waste until servants could clean him. The smell of the sick room, a cloying mixture of lavender water, camphor, and decay, became the secret scent of the court. But the humiliation went deeper than mere helplessness. It turned violent. As the frontal lobes of his brain continued to deteriorate, the king's behavior became increasingly disinhibited. The romantic on the throne, the man who had dreamed of building a Christian utopia, began to attack his own body. There are dark, whispered accounts from the archives that describe the king's restlessness. This is a euphemism. In reality, in his confusion and frustration, Frederick William would sometimes fall into fits of self-harm. Unable to speak, unable to scream out his rage at the prison of his paralysis, he would turn his functioning left hand against himself. He would scratch at his own face, claw at his clothes, or tear at the bedding. It was a primal, animalistic reaction to entrapment. To prevent the king from injuring himself, the unthinkable became necessary. The sovereign had to be physically restrained. The king of Prussia, the descendant of Frederick the Great, thrashing in his wheelchair, his face twisted in a rictus of silent agony, while his own servants, men who had sworn oaths of fealty to die for him, were forced to hold his wrists down. They had to clip his fingernails short, like those of a dangerous patient, to stop him from tearing his skin. There were times when makeshift restraints were used, soft silk scarves tied around his wrist to the arms of the chair, disguised as blankets or shawls, but serving the purpose of shackles. This was the Sanssouci paradox in its most brutal form. The palace was designed for the elevation of the human spirit. It was a place of high windows looking out over terraced vineyards, of libraries stocked with the works of Hegel and Kant, of music rooms where Bach was revered. And in the center of this temple of high culture sat a man who had been reduced to pure instinct. The marble busts of the philosophers looked down on a king who was fighting his nurses. The contrast between the setting and the action was grotesque. It was as if a tragedy by Shakespeare was being performed in a nursery school, but the actors didn't know the lines. The loss of dignity was also social. In the beginning, the court tried to maintain the fiction of normalcy. The king was wheeled out for small dinners or tea circles. Selected courtiers, diplomats, and old friends were invited. These gatherings were excruciating exercises in denial. The guests would sit stiffly, making polite conversation about the weather or the opera, while trying desperately not to look at the head of the table. There sat the king, propped up with pillows, his eyes often wandering vacantly around the ceiling. Sometimes he would make sudden, Loud noises, guttural groans or sharp barking sounds that shattered the polite atmosphere. The guests would freeze, teacups halfway to their mouths, pretending they hadn't heard anything. The queen would gently stroke his hand and murmur soothing words, covering the awkwardness with a blanket of royal etiquette. But everyone knew. They could see the vacancy. They could smell the sickness. One particularly poignant visitor during this period was Alexander von Humboldt. The great scientist and explorer was practically a national institution himself, a close friend and intellectual sparring partner of the king for decades. Humboldt was ancient by this point, in his late 80s, himself fading. When he came to visit his royal friend, it was a meeting of two crumbling monuments. Humboldt, still sharp but physically frail, sat by the wheelchair. He tried to talk to the king about science, about the cosmos, about the things that had once lit a fire in Frederick William's eyes. The king stared at him. He recognized Humboldt. There was a flicker of recognition, a widening of the eyes, but he could not respond. He reached out with his left hand and grasped Humboldt's arm, squeezing it with a desperate, painful strength. He would not let go. It was the grip of a drowning man clutching at a piece of driftwood. Humboldt, deeply moved and distressed, sat there for a long time, held prisoner by the king's silence. When he finally left, the great scientist reportedly wept, telling a confidant that seeing the brilliant mind he had loved reduced to such a ruin was the greatest sorrow of his life. The king's world began to shrink. As his condition worsened and his behavior became more erratic, the circle of visitors was tightened. The dinner party stopped. The diplomatic reception ceased. He was slowly erased from the social world. He became a living ghost, a rumor in his own palace. The servants moved around him in silence, treating him less like a person and more like a fragile, dangerous object. There were days when the king seemed to be aware of this erasure. The tragedy of vascular dementia is that it is often not a constant darkness. It is a flickering light. There were moments of terrible clarity. On one occasion, he was wheeled past a mirror. He caught sight of his own reflection, the bloated face, the slumped posture, the wheelchair. He stopped. He stared at the image for a long time. Tears began to roll down his cheeks. He pointed at the mirror with his shaking left hand and made a sound that those present interpreted as a question. Is that me? He knew. Somewhere in the wreckage of his neurons, he knew that he was a grotesque parody of what he had been. He remembered the young prince who had ridden through the streets of Berlin to cheering crowds. He remembered the king who had stood in the nave of Cologne Cathedral, and he compared that memory to the image in the glass. The shame of that realization must have been searing. It was a psychological amputation. The indignity was compounded by the medical treatments that continued relentlessly. The doctors, desperate to show they were doing something, turned the king's body into a testing ground. They decided that the paralysis might be treated with friction. The king was subjected to vigorous, painful massages, where attendants would rub his paralyzed limbs with rough cloths and irritants until the skin was raw, trying to wake up the nerves. They used early forms of electrotherapy, shocking his muscles with galvanic batteries. The king would jump and whimper as the current hit him, a conductive experiment in a crown. These treatments did nothing to heal his brain, but they succeeded in stripping him of any remaining physical privacy. He was poked, prodded, shocked, and bled. His body was public property. The divinity that supposedly hedged a king had been replaced by the cold, clinical gaze of 19th century medicine. He was a specimen of ramollissement, a case study to be documented in medical journals, his symptoms catalogued with dispassionate accuracy, while his humanity was ignored. Even his spiritual life, the bedrock of his existence, was taken from him. Frederick William had been a man of deep, almost mystical faith. He loved the liturgy, the hymns, the sermons. Now, he was wheeled into the palace chapel like a piece of furniture. He could not sing. He could not pray aloud. When the pastor spoke of salvation and the resurrection of the body, what did the king think? Did he look down at his withered arm and wonder why God had abandoned him? There were times during the services when he would become agitated, making loud noises, during the silent prayers, forcing the queen to signal for him to be wheeled out. The church, his sanctuary, became just another place where he didn't belong. As the months turned into years, the indignity became routine. The shock wore off, replaced by a dull, grinding misery. The servants stopped flinching at the smell. The courtiers stopped asking how the king was because the answer was always the same. He was becoming part of the furniture of Sans Souci, a broken clock that no one bothered to fix, but no one dared to throw away. This total loss of dignity, this transformation from a divinely appointed ruler into a biological burden, created a terrifying vacuum at the heart of the Prussian state. A king who cannot speak, who cannot control his bowels, and who has to be restrained from scratching his own face, cannot rule a modern industrial power. The fiction that His Majesty is recovering could only be sustained for so long before it became a farce. The political machinery could not wait for the king to die. The state needed a signature. It needed a voice. It needed a mind. And since the king had none of these things left, the decision was made to fabricate them. If the king could not rule, he would be made to act as if he ruled. The loss of his dignity in the bedroom necessitated the creation of a fraudulent dignity in the public eye. The stage was set for the next act of the tragedy, the transformation of the biological wreck into a political puppet. The silence of the sick room was a private tragedy. The silence of the throne was a national emergency. In a hereditary monarchy, the physical body of the king and the political body of the state are fused. When one rots, the other begins to smell. As 1858 broke over a nervous Prussia, the political elite faced a terrifying paradox. The king was mentally dead, but the crown was legally alive. Frederick William IV was not just a head of state. He was the summus episcopus of the Protestant Church, the supreme warlord of the army, and the sole source of executive law. Every officer swore loyalty to him personally, not to the Constitution. Every minister served at his pleasure. But the pleasure of the king was now expressed in guttural moans and weeping fits. He could not read a treaty, let alone understand the geopolitical shifting of tectonic plates between Austria and France. A power vacuum of this magnitude is a dangerous thing. In the 19th century, with the embers of the 1848 revolution still glowing in the dark corners of Berlin's beer halls, a leaderless state was an invitation to chaos. If the liberals knew the king was a vegetable, they would demand a fully constitutional monarchy. If the reactionaries knew, they might stage a coup. And so the decision was made to perform the greatest magic trick in Prussian history. The Palace of Sans Souci was transformed from a royal residence into a theater set. The play was titled The King Reigns, and the lead actor was a man who didn't know he was on stage. This was the era of the shadow government. While the king sat in his wheelchair staring at dust motes dancing in the light, a fierce battle for control raged around him. On one side was the queen, Elizabeth Ludovica, the fierce guardian of his dignity, who refused to admit he was gone. On the other was the king's brother, Prince Wilhelm, the future Kaiser Wilhelm I. Wilhelm was a man of blood and iron, long before Bismarck coined the phrase. He was a soldier, stiff, practical, and utterly devoid of his brother's romanticism. He watched the charade with growing impatience. He knew the state needed a captain, but the queen blocked his path, using the king's living body as a shield. For nearly a year, the queen and the court camaraderie maintained the fiction that the king was merely resting. They issued official medical bulletins that were masterpieces of deceit. The newspapers reported that His Majesty was suffering from nervous exhaustion and temporary weakness. They spoke of his steady recovery and his good spirits. They never mentioned the nappies, the restraints, or the aphasia. The Prussian public was fed a diet of hopeful lies, but lies require visual evidence to be believed. And this is where the tragedy descended into the grotesque. To quell the rumors of the king's insanity, the court had to show him. The scene that played out repeatedly at the windows of Sanssouci is one of the most chilling images of 19th century royalty. On sunny afternoons, when the crowds of loyal subjects gathered in the park below, hoping for a glimpse of their beloved romantic king, the stage managers would go to work. Inside the palace, the king would be prepped. He was dressed in his full military uniform, the blue tunic of the Prussian infantry, the epaulettes of a general, the iron cross pinned to his chest. His hair was combed, his mustache waxed. He was lifted from his bed and strapped into his wheelchair. The attendants would wheel him to the large ground floor windows that looked out over the terraces. But a king who sits motionless like a wax doll inspires fear, not confidence. The people needed a sign of life. They needed a wave. The king, paralyzed on his right side and cognitively adrift, could not wave. So a solution was engineered. An attendant, usually a strong, discreet valet, would position himself directly behind the wheelchair, hidden from the view of the crowd by the heavy velvet curtains or the high back of the chair itself. As the window was opened, the roar of the crowd would wash in, hoch, hoch, hoch. The king would often flinch at the noise, his eyes darting around in confusion. Then at a signal, the hidden attendant would reach out, grasp the king's functioning left arm, and physically lift it. From the park below, the illusion was perfect. The people saw their king resplendent in uniform, raising his hand in a benevolent blessing to his subjects. They cheered wilder, tears streaming down their faces, convinced that the rumors of his demise were French lies. Up close, the reality was a horror show. The king's arm was a dead weight being puppeted by another man. His face was often a mask of blank terror or vacancy. Sometimes he would be drooling, and a second attendant, crouching below the window frame, would have to wipe his chin between waves. The moment the window was closed, the arm would drop, the king would slump, and the monarch would be wheeled back into the shadows to have his diaper changed. It was a zombie monarchy. The king was a special effect, a prop used to buy time for the politicians. The puppetry extended to the paperwork of the state. In Prussia, the king's signature was the engine of government. Nothing happened without the royal sign manual. But a man with a paralyzed right arm and a liquefied brain cannot sign his name. At first, the queen tried to guide his hand. She would place a pen in his trembling fingers, wrap her own hand around his, and force the motion of the signature, Frederick Wilhelm. But the result was a jagged, illegible scrawl, a spider walk of ink that looked nothing like the flowing script of the king. It was the handwriting of a madman. When this became impossible, the court resorted to a stamp. A facsimile of the royal signature was created. Documents, military commissions, civil service appointments, minor laws were brought into the sick room. A minister would read the title, and then, with the king sitting passively nearby, the stamp would be pressed onto the paper. Thump. The king had signed. The will of the state was executed by a piece of rubber, while the actual will of the sovereign was lost in a fog of aphasia. Inside the palace, Sanssouci ceased to be a home and became a high-security prison hospital. The queen and her faction, the Camarilla, controlled access with an iron fist. They feared that if the king's brother Wilhelm saw the true extent of the decay, he would declare the king incapacitated and seize the throne, which of course was exactly what Wilhelm intended to do. The corridors whispered with spies. The doctors were bribed for information. The servants were watched. Every time the king had a bad day, screaming, tearing at his clothes, smearing food on his face, the doors were locked tight. His Majesty is sleeping, the chamberlains would tell the waiting ministers. But the most tragic aspect of this puppet king era was the confusion of the puppet himself. There is evidence that Frederick William, in his lucid windows, felt the humiliation of his position. He was being used. He was a prop in his own palace. There is a heartbreaking account of a military parade held in the park. The king was wheeled out to the terrace to review the troops. The bands played martial music, the music he had always loved. The soldiers marched in perfect goose step. The king sat there, wrapped in blankets. As the flags passed, the old instinct kicked in. He tried to stand up. He tried to salute, but his body wouldn't obey. He struggled in his chair, making incoherent sounds of distress, his left hand flapping uselessly against the armrest. The queen had to hold him down, whispering frantically in his ear to calm him. The soldiers marched past, eyes right, saluting a man who was fighting a war against his own nervous system. To the troops, he was the warlord. To the doctors standing nervously nearby, he was a medical emergency waiting to happen. Finally, the charade collapsed under its own weight. The state could not run on rubber stamps and puppet shows forever. The pressure from Prince Wilhelm and the government became irresistible. In October 1858, a year after the stroke, the queen was forced to capitulate. She could no longer hide the fact that the king was mentally gone. A regency was signed. Prince Wilhelm took over as regent. The shadow government was dissolved. But even then, the puppetry didn't fully stop. Frederick William was still the king. He was not deposed, he was merely incapacitated. He remained the titular head of state for another 2.5 years. He was moved around like a precious broken antique. When the court moved to Charlottenburg or Tegernsee, the package, as some cynically called the royal transport, was moved with them. Special carriages were designed to accommodate his wheelchair. Train schedules were altered to ensure he traveled at night, so no one would see him being carried like a sack of grain onto the royal carriage. He was a secret that had to be transported with full military honors. The king had become a living idol, venerated, worshipped, but utterly lifeless. The tragedy was that the idol could still feel pain. He could still weep. He could still feel the shame of the stare-down. In the end, the puppet king phase was a cruel commentary on the nature of power. We like to believe that authority comes from competence, from strength, from the ability to lead. But the final years of Frederick William IV proved that power is often just a costume. If you put the uniform on a broken man and prop him up in the right window, the world will still cheer. They cheer the symbol, not the human. And while the crowds cheered the puppet in the window, inside the room, the strings were being pulled by a woman who was slowly destroying herself to keep the show on the road. The final act of this tragedy belongs not to the king, but to the wife who became his jailer, his nurse, and his only link to humanity. In the center of this swirling vortex of biological decay and political puppetry stood a figure of tragic, almost terrifying resolve, Queen Elizabeth Ludovica. To the outside world, she was the dignified, pious consort, a Bavarian princess draped in the silks of the Prussian court. But inside the sealed apartments of Sanssouci, She was something else entirely. She was the gatekeeper, the interpreter, the nurse, and the jailer. She was the architect of the king's survival, and unwittingly, the prolonged instrument of his torture. If the king was the prisoner of his own body, Elizabeth was the prisoner of her own heart. The story of Frederick William IV's final years is, at its core, a warped love story. It is a testament to a devotion so fierce that it defied medical logic, political pressure, and the natural order of life and death. To understand the magnitude of her sacrifice and the cruelty of it, we must look at who she was. Elizabeth was of Wittelsbach, a Catholic in a staunchly Protestant dynasty. She had always been an outsider, viewed with suspicion by the rigid Prussian aristocracy. But she and Frederick William shared a profound mystical bond. They were soulmates in the truest sense, united by a love of art, a romantic vision of monarchy, and a shared intense piety. When he fell, she did not step back as many royal consorts might have, leaving the care to physicians and servants. She stepped forward. She wrapped her arms around the ruin of her husband and refused to let go. From the moment the stroke struck in 1857, Elizabeth effectively abdicated her role as queen to become a full-time live-in nurse. It was a transformation that shocked the court. In the 19th century, royalty did not touch the sick. Illness was handled by staff, but Elizabeth moved her bed into the king's sick room. She banished the rotation of indifferent nurses. She determined that if the king was to be fed, it would be by her hand. If he was to be cleaned, she would oversee it. If he was to be comforted, it would be by her voice. This decision created a hermetically sealed world, a sanctuary of sorrow within the palace. Elizabeth drew an iron curtain around the king. She controlled who entered and who left. She censored the newspapers read to him. She filtered the news of the world, creating a fictitious bubble of peace where the king still ruled, where the revolution hadn't happened, where he was simply recovering. But the physical reality of her role was brutal. We must strip away the royal titles to see the human labor involved. Caring for a stroke victim with severe aphasia and incontinence is exhausting, back-breaking work. Elizabeth was a woman in her late 50s, herself not in robust health. Yet for 4 years, she lived on the rhythm of the king's biological needs. She learned to read the landscape of his broken mind better than any doctor. When the king made the guttural, repetitive sounds that had replaced his eloquence, often just a string of ugh, 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 Elizabeth claimed to understand him. She became his translator. When ministers or family members were permitted a brief audience, they would look at the babbling king in bewilderment and then turn to the queen. Elizabeth would nod, her face drawn and pale, and say, "His Majesty is concerned about the harvest in Silesia," or "The king wishes to express his gratitude." Was she truly understanding him, or was she projecting her own thoughts onto his silence? It was likely a mix of both. She knew his mind so well that she could guess his reactions, but there was also a desperate delusion at play. She needed him to be there. She could not accept that the partner of her soul was gone, leaving only a biological husk. So she filled in the blanks. She animated the puppet with her own will. She sustained his personhood through sheer force of imagination. This role took a catastrophic toll on her. Observers noted that the queen aged decades in months. Her hair turned white. Her posture, once regal, became stooped. Her eyes were permanently rimmed with red from lack of sleep and secret weeping. She developed a nervous tic, a trembling in her hands that mirrored the king's own palsy. She barely ate, sustaining herself on coffee and prayer. She was consuming herself to keep him warm. The atmosphere she created was one of suffocating intimacy. The sick room was kept warm, almost hot, to protect the king's circulation. The heavy curtains were rarely fully opened. In this twilight, the queen and the king existed in a bizarre symbiosis. She would sit by his chair for hours, holding his functioning hand, reading the Bible to him. When he had his fits of weeping, those terrible, uncontrollable, emotional floods caused by the brain damage, she was the only one who could soothe him. She would stroke his forehead, wipe the saliva from his chin, and whisper the endearments of their youth until the sobbing subsided into a whimper. But there was a darker side to this devotion. By refusing to institutionalize him, by refusing to acknowledge the hopelessness of his condition, Elizabeth was also his jailer. There were moments when the king, in his confusion and frustration, seemed to want to escape. He would struggle against the restraints of his chair. He would gesture wildly at the door. He would look at the window with a longing that bordered on desperation. But Elizabeth would not let him go. She kept him tethered to the throne and to life. The doctors found themselves in an impossible position. They knew the case was hopeless. They knew the king's brain was atrophying, but they could not tell the queen to stop. She demanded every new treatment, every experimental remedy. She fought every infection with the ferocity of a tigress. When pneumonia threatened to carry him off, a golden bridge to death that would have ended his suffering, Elizabeth rallied the physicians, forced fluids, sat up for nights on end, and pulled him back from the brink. She saved his life over and over again. And in doing so, she condemned him to more time in the diaper, more time in the chair, more time in the prison of his own silence. It is the terrible paradox of extreme love. It cannot bear to let the beloved go, even when letting go is the only mercy left. Her relationship with the king's brother, the Prince Regent Wilhelm, became toxic. Wilhelm was the practical ruler now, dealing with the realities of the state. He needed to make decisions. He needed the king to be declared incurable so the regency could be fully empowered. But Elizabeth blocked him at every turn. She viewed Wilhelm as a vulture circling her husband. She refused to sign papers admitting the king's incapacity. She forced Wilhelm to come to the sick room and consult with the babbling king, a humiliating ritual where Wilhelm had to pretend to take orders from a brother who was drooling on his uniform. This friction isolated her further. The court split into factions. The queen's circle became a fortress of denial. Inside the fortress, the queen performed her grim duties. She learned the intimate geography of his decaying body, the bed sores that had to be tended, the digestion that had to be managed, the spasms that had to be massaged. There is a particularly haunting detail from the archives regarding the king's restlessness. As mentioned, he would often claw at himself. Elizabeth couldn't bear to see him tied down by servants. So she would hold his hands herself for hours. She would sit interlocking her fingers with his, using her own strength to restrain his self-harm. It was a physical struggle disguised as an embrace. It was a wrestling match with decay. The psychological burden of being the sole witness to his fall was crushing. She remembered him as the dashing intellectual who had courted her. Now she was wiping his bottom. She saw the light go out of his eyes, flicker back for a second, and then vanish again. She bore the brunt of his tantrums. When the king threw his food, it was Elizabeth who cleaned it up. When he pushed her away in a fit of pique, it was Elizabeth who swallowed the hurt and came back with a fresh spoon. She was protecting his dignity from the world, but she had to absorb the indignity herself. She absorbed it all. The smell, the sights, the sounds of a great man reduced to an infant. She became the vessel for all the shame that the king could no longer feel or express. In the evenings, when the king finally slept, Sedated by laudanum or sheer exhaustion, Elizabeth would retreat to her small cot at the foot of his bed. She would write letters to her family in Bavaria, letters that are drenched in a unique kind of agony. She wrote of her angel, her poor suffering martyr. She framed his illness as a religious trial, a cross they had to bear together. She never complained of the smell or the work. She only complained of his suffering. "My heart breaks 1,000 times a day," she wrote in 1859. "To see this spirit, so high and flighty, now chained to the earth by such heavy fetters. But I will not leave him. I will stand by his cross until the end." It was a martyrdom, but it was a martyrdom that required a victim. The king was the victim of her sanctity. As 1860 approached, the Iron Curtain began to fray. The king's physical decline accelerated. The seizures became more frequent. The moments of recognition became rarer. The translator began to run out of words. Elizabeth could no longer pretend he was communicating. He was sinking into a deep biological twilight where no voice could reach him. Yet even then, she hovered. She checked the temperature of his broth. She adjusted his pillows. She prayed over him. She was the caretaker wife, the guardian of the tomb, waiting for the occupant to finally die so she could mourn him properly. But as long as his chest heaved, as long as a pulse fluttered in his neck, she stood guard, a sentinel in black silk, ensuring that the world showed respect to the shell of what had been Frederick William IV. Her tragedy was that she succeeded. She kept him alive. She kept him on the throne. She kept him dignified in the eyes of the public. But the cost was 4 years of a living hell in the back rooms of Sanssouci, a hell where love was the lock on the door. By the winter of 1860, the long, agonizing twilight of the Prussian court had deepened into a black night. The biological clock, which had been ticking with such cruel slowness for 3 years, finally began to wind down. The King of Prussia was no longer truly inhabiting the palace of Sanssouci. He was merely haunting it. The grand masquerade that had been sustained by the Queen and the Camarilla, the fiction that the monarch was recovering, had dissolved under the weight of inevitable physiological reality. Everyone, from the lowest scullery maid scrubbing the flagstones to the Prince Regent Wilhelm pacing in his study, knew that the end was not just near, but overdue. The atmosphere in Potsdam was heavy, suffocating, like the air in a room where a clock has stopped. The king's physical state in these final months was a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human body, even when the mind has long since fled. Frederick William IV had become a living preparation, a medical specimen of total system failure. The softening of the brain had advanced to its terminal phase. The seizures, which had once been violent storms shaking his frame, had subsided into a lethargic, comatose stillness. The aphasia was total. There were no more frustrated cries, no more babbling attempts to communicate with his angel, Elizabeth. There was only silence, broken by the rasping, irregular rhythm of his breathing. The romantic on the throne had retreated into a deep, impenetrable biological fortress, locking the doors from the inside. The winter of 1860 to 1861 was particularly harsh. The wind howled around the Rococo statues in the gardens of Sanssouci, burying the vineyards in snow. Inside the sick room, the heat was stifling. The Queen, now a spectral figure of exhaustion, barely left the bedside. She had ceased her frantic efforts to stimulate his mind. Her role had shifted from nurse to death watch. She sat for hours holding his hand, that hand which was now thin, translucent, the skin like parchment over brittle bone. She was no longer fighting for his life. She was keeping vigil over his dying. The medical details of these final weeks are grim. The king's swallowing reflex, which had been compromised for years, finally failed. Nutrition became a desperate, dangerous affair. Every spoonful of liquid was a risk of aspiration pneumonia. The doctors, still hovering like black-coated crows, whispered about inanition, starvation. The king was fading not just from the brain damage, but from a slow metabolic collapse. He was shrinking. The bloated, plethoric face of the 1850s had sunken into a gaunt mask. The flesh was melting away, revealing the skull beneath, as if death was sculpting him back into the essential shape of mortality. On the morning of January 1st, 1861, the final crisis began. The king slipped into a deep coma. His breathing changed, taking on the ominous cyclical pattern known to physicians as Cheney-Stokes respiration. Periods of rapid, deep breathing followed by terrifying pauses of apnea where the chest did not move at all. Each pause felt like an eternity to the watchers in the room. Was that it? Had he gone? And then with a gasping, rattling intake of air, the machine would kickstart again. It was the sound of the body fighting a war it had already lost. The news spread through the palace and then to Berlin by telegraph. The king is dying. The regency was effectively over. The reign of Wilhelm was about to begin. The court officials began to gather, moving with the hushed, respectful urgency of undertakers. There is a peculiar bureaucracy to a royal death. Protocols must be observed. The witnesses must be present. The handover of power must be seamless. While Elizabeth prayed for his soul, the state apparatus prepared to certify his corpse. The end came on January 2nd, 1861. It was a dark, cold morning. In the study of Sans Souci, the room where Frederick the Great had once played his flute, Frederick William IV lay propped up on pillows. The Queen was on her knees by the bed. The Prince Regent stood nearby, his face a mask of conflict, grief for a brother, but also the heavy, solemn realization of the crown descending onto his own head. At 8:40 in the morning, the rattling breath stopped. There was a final shallow sigh. The chest settled. The king's eyes, which had been half open, staring at a reality no one else could see, became fixed. The physician leaned in, placed a mirror to the lips, checked the pulse, and then straightened up. He looked at the Prince Regent and bowed. "His Majesty is dead." The words broke the spell. For 4 years, Prussia had been ruled by a ghost. Now, the ghost was gone. The relief in the room was palpable, though no one would dare express it. The suffering was over. The humiliation was over. The diapers, the restraints, the charades at the window, it was all finished. The Sans Souci paradox had been resolved by the only power greater than the monarchy: death. But the death of a king is never just a biological event. It is a seismic political shift. As the Queen collapsed in grief, refusing to leave the body, the machinery of the state roared into life. The king is dead. Long live the king. Within minutes, Prince Wilhelm was no longer the regent. He was King Wilhelm I of Prussia. The transition was jarring. Frederick William IV had been a man of the past, a medievalist, a dreamer, a man who looked backward to the Holy Roman Empire for inspiration. Wilhelm I was a man of the future, a soldier, a pragmatist, a man who looked to the rifle and the railway. The moment Frederick William's heart stopped, the romantic era in German politics died with him. The soft focus of the Biedermeier period was replaced instantly by the sharp metallic focus of the industrial age. This shift was embodied in the rise of one man, a man who had been waiting in the wings, watching the slow decay of the old king with calculating eyes: Otto von Bismarck. Frederick William IV had distrusted Bismarck. He found the Junker too radical, too ruthless, too bloodthirsty. He had famously written "Red Reactionary, Smells of Blood" on Bismarck's personnel file. As long as the Romantic king had any cognitive function, Bismarck was kept at arm's length. But the vacuum created by the king's long illness had weakened the liberals and frustrated the conservatives. The state was paralyzed, drifting. It needed a hard hand. When Wilhelm took the throne, he inherited a deadlock with the parliament. He needed a minister of force to break it. Within a year of Frederick William's death, Bismarck was appointed minister-president. He would famously declare that the great questions of the time would not be resolved by speeches and majority decisions. The tools of the Romantic king's failed 1848 experiments, but by iron and blood. It is no exaggeration to say that the German Empire was born in the death chamber of Frederick William IV. If the Romantic king had been healthy, if he had reigned for another 20 years, with his soft power and his wavering intellect, history would have been radically different. But his brain had liquefied, and in the void he left, the Iron Chancellor built a machine of war. The silence of Sans Souci was the prelude to the roar of the cannons at Sadowa and Sedan. The funeral of Frederick William IV was a final, somber pageant. He was buried in the Friedenskirche in Potsdam, a church he had designed himself. It was a fitting resting place, a building born of his artistic imagination, housing the wreckage of his biological reality. The Queen, Elizabeth, was broken. She survived him, but she did not truly live. She spent her remaining years as a widow in pure mourning, tending to his memory, editing his papers, and trying to polish the tarnish from his legacy. She died in 1873 while visiting her family in Dresden and was brought back to lie beside her angel. They lie there still, the Romantic and his nurse, united in the marble silence of the crypt. But the story of Frederick William IV leaves a long shadow that stretches far beyond his own grave. It is a shadow that falls across the entire history of the Hohenzollern dynasty, a dark premonition of the catastrophe to come. The king's illness exposed the fatal flaw of hereditary monarchy in the modern age, a system that relies entirely on the biological fitness of a single individual, is a system built on sand. When the king's arteries hardened, the state hardened. When the king's mind softened, the state drifted. The 4 years of his living death demonstrated that the divine right was a fiction that could not withstand the assault of biology. A king could be anointed by God, but he could still be destroyed by a blood clot. There is a grim biological echo in the future of his dynasty. His brother Wilhelm I would be shot at by assassins, but survive to a great old age. But Wilhelm's son, Frederick III, the hope of the liberals, the man who might have turned Germany into a British-style democracy, would also be struck down by a horrific disease. He would reign for only 99 days, dying of throat cancer, unable to speak, scribbling his commands on scraps of paper, just as his uncle had tried to do. And so the crown would pass to the erratic, neurologically unstable Wilhelm II, the man who would finally drive the Hohenzollern bus off the cliff in 1914. It seems that the House of Prussia was cursed not by demons, but by its own genetics and the sheer crushing pressure of the crown. Frederick William IV was the first casualty in a slow-motion collapse of the royal nervous system. In the final analysis, the story of the Romantic on the throne is a tragedy of incompatibility. He was a man with the soul of a poet forced to do the job of a CEO. He was a man who wanted to be loved in an era that only respected power. And ultimately, he was a man who fought a war against his own biology and lost. The image that lingers is not the portrait of the young king in his velvet robes, nor the statue of him on horseback. It is the image of the old man in the wheelchair at the window of Sans Souci, the man with the dead arm and the weeping eyes, the man being waved at the crowd by a servant hiding behind the curtain. This is the ultimate truth of the Hollow Crown. We build palaces, we compose anthems, and we forge iron crosses to create the illusion of permanence. Ultimately, the story reveals the terrified human animal behind the velvet curtain. The king dies not in glory, but in a diaper, and the world moves on without a pause. The romance is gone. Only the silence remains.